At 7:30 in the morning, Patricia Holloway sat alone in her kitchen. Her fingers trembled as she held a cup of coffee she hadn't touched in over an hour. It had gone cold. Outside, the sun was rising over Bridgeton, Mississippi, the way it did every morning, soft, gentle light pouring over a town still half asleep. But Patricia wasn't sleeping. She hadn't slept all night. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Her son, Darius, hadn't come home. And the silence that filled the walls felt heavier than anything she had known. On the table in front of her, her phone lit up again. A message she had read at least a dozen times blinked on the screen, short, sharp words that cut deeper than anything anyone had ever said to her. "We need to talk. I can't do this anymore." It was from Keisha Freeman. 20 years old. Her son's girlfriend. The girl Patricia had welcomed into her home. The girl who had dinner with them every Sunday. The girl Patricia had come to know better than anyone else. Or at least, that's what she told herself. What Patricia thought, sitting at that kitchen table, no one will ever fully know. Whether she was filled with regret, or rage, or fear. Whether she knew what she was about to do, or whether something in her had already broken beyond repair. What we do know, is that by the end of that day, Keisha Freeman would be dead. Her body would be found inside the Holloway home. And Patricia Holloway, the woman who once smiled proudly at her son's graduation, would be sitting in the back of a police car, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. What happened between the time Patricia stared at that message and the moment police officers crossed the threshold of her front door, is a story that would tear apart a family, shock an entire town, and leave everyone asking the same question: how far can a secret go before someone dies for it? Some crimes don't start with a gunshot. They don't begin with blood on the floor or a scream in the night. Sometimes, they start quietly. In a kitchen. At a table. With a message that says everything, and nothing, all at once. Today, we uncover the full story. The affair that was never meant to be known. The betrayal that shattered a family. The murder that ended a young woman's life far too soon. And the question that still lingers long after the trial, the verdict, and the headlines faded away. Who really killed Keisha Freeman? And why? This is In the Shadows of Crime, and this is a story of love, betrayal, and murder in Bridgeton, Mississippi, a story you won't soon forget. Bridgeton, Mississippi. A town you might miss if you blink too long on Highway 23. A place where church bells still ring on Sunday mornings, and where neighbors wave to each other from their porches. A town that hadn't seen a murder in over 15 years. Until that day. Patricia Holloway had lived in Bridgeton her whole life. 44 years old, she was a woman people described as quiet, polite, always willing to help. She worked as a nurse at the county hospital, 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, taking care of people no one else seemed to have time for. But while Patricia was known in town, she wasn't known well. People saw her smile at church, nod in the grocery store, but when she went home, she closed the door and didn't open it to many. And after her husband, Eric Holloway, passed away from a sudden stroke 8 years earlier, it seemed like Patricia had built walls around her life that no one could quite see through. Her son, Darius Holloway, was a different story. He was 22 years old, a bright kid, known for playing basketball at the community park and for his sharp mind in the classroom. He had been studying criminal justice at the local college, dreaming of becoming a detective, maybe to follow in his father's footsteps, or maybe to find justice for others in ways life hadn't given him. Everyone liked Darius. The teachers. The neighbors. Even the pastor at the First Baptist Church on Main Street used to say that if anyone could make something of himself, it was Darius. And then there was Keisha Freeman. Keisha was 20 years old. Beautiful, confident, with a smile that could light up a room, but a sharpness that made people pay attention when she spoke. She was studying nursing, said she wanted to be the kind of nurse who actually listened to people, not just pushed pills and walked away. That's how she met Patricia, when she started shadowing nurses at the county hospital. People said Keisha looked up to Patricia. Called her Miss Holloway with respect. But over time, the lines between respect and something else started to blur. Keisha and Darius had been together for a year and a half. To most people, they seemed like a good match. Young love in a small town, everyone expected they'd probably get married. But there were whispers. Small things people noticed. Like the way Patricia would sometimes look at Keisha when she thought no one was watching. Or how Keisha started spending more time at the Holloway house, even when Darius wasn't there. Nobody thought much of it, at first. Keisha came from a rougher part of Bridgeton, where life hadn't been easy. Maybe she saw Patricia as a kind of mother figure, someone she could talk to. At least, that's what people told themselves. But things were changing. By the fall of 2021, Darius had started noticing something he couldn't quite explain. Keisha seemed distant. Cold, sometimes. And Patricia, she had started asking Keisha to stay late, helping with dinner or just sitting in the living room, long after Darius had gone out. There was a tension in that house, building like a storm no one wanted to see coming. On November 16th, the day before Keisha was killed, there were arguments. First, between Darius and Keisha. And then, later that night, between Patricia and Keisha. Neighbors heard them. Muffled voices, raised tones. But in a town where people minded their own business, nobody called the police. Nobody asked questions. Keisha went home that night. But only after Patricia followed her out to her car. They stood in the driveway, speaking in low, tense voices. No one could say what was said between them. But some would later tell police that they had never seen Patricia's face look like that before. Cold. Tight. As if something had snapped. The next morning, November 17th, Keisha sent Patricia a message. Short. Direct. And final. We need to talk. I can't do this anymore. We don't know what Patricia thought when she read those words. But we do know that hours later, Keisha would walk through the door of the Holloway home for what would be the last time. She never walked out. To understand how things got to that point, how a mother, a son, and a girlfriend became locked in a deadly triangle, we need to go back further. To the days before anyone knew a murder was coming. To the moments when what might have seemed like small choices, became the cracks that would eventually bring everything crashing down. The weeks leading up to November 17th were filled with moments that, at the time, might have seemed ordinary. But when pieced together later, they would paint a picture of relationships unraveling, trust corroding, and emotions quietly reaching a dangerous breaking point. Keisha Freeman had been spending more time at the Holloway home. At first, it was seen as a sign that the relationship with Darius was growing stronger. She would help Patricia with chores, sit with her for coffee, even stay over when Darius had long shifts or nights out with friends. But slowly, people close to them began to notice things that didn't quite add up. There were afternoons when neighbors would see Keisha's car parked outside long before Darius returned home. There were evenings when lights in the house would stay on well past midnight. From across the street, a neighbor would later recall seeing Patricia and Keisha sitting on the porch, their faces close in conversation, but no one could hear what they were saying. It was around that time when Darius started withdrawing from his friends. He wasn't returning calls, wasn't showing up for classes as often. His best friend, a young man he had grown up with since middle school, would later say that Darius had begun asking strange questions. Questions about betrayal. About trust. About what it means when people closest to you start acting differently. There were other signs too. Patricia, who had always been known for her calm and collected nature, had become irritable at work. Nurses she had worked with for years said she would lose her temper over small things. Some would say she looked exhausted. Others would say she looked lost. But no one, not even those who knew her best, imagine just how far things had gone between her and Keisha. Some said it was loneliness that drove Patricia to form a bond with her son's girlfriend. After years of raising Darius alone, of working long shifts, of losing the only man she had ever loved, maybe Keisha became someone she could talk to. Someone who understood her pain. But what started as friendship, turned into something else. And by the time anyone realized it, it was already too late. In late October, Darius showed up unexpectedly at home one afternoon and found Keisha there. Patricia had told him she was having a personal talk with Keisha, but as Darius would later say to police, the way they were sitting, the distance between them, made him stop and wonder. He didn't say anything that day. But from that moment on, the doubt began to grow. Tension filled that house. There were arguments between Darius and Keisha that no one else heard. And there were silences between Darius and Patricia that were louder than words. He would leave the house for hours, sometimes all night, returning only when he had to. And when he was home, Keisha and Patricia would exchange glances that seemed heavy with meaning, a meaning Darius couldn't quite figure out. But the truth was something even darker than he could imagine. By then, Patricia and Keisha were involved in something that crossed every line. And what no one knew was that Keisha had started to pull away. The closeness that once tied them together had turned into something she wanted out of. But Patricia wasn't ready to let her go. In early November, Keisha had begun spending more nights at her own apartment. She started missing dinners at the Holloway house. She stopped answering Patricia's calls as quickly as she used to. Friends of Keisha would later tell detectives that she had confided in them. That she was feeling trapped. That Patricia had become possessive. And that she was afraid of what might happen if Darius ever found out. But she never told Darius. She kept the secret, whether out of fear or confusion, no one could say. And that secret grew heavier every day. November 15th. 2 days before the murder. Keisha was seen crying in her car outside her apartment. She sat there for over an hour, head in her hands. A friend saw her, tried to approach, but Keisha waved her off. Later, that same night, Keisha was back at the Holloway house. She had dinner with Patricia. Darius wasn't home. No one knows what was said that night, but it was the last time anyone would see Keisha in public. The next day, November 16th, Darius finally confronted Keisha. He had seen Patricia and Keisha talking in hushed tones earlier that week. And when he asked Keisha what was going on, she said nothing, but her face, according to Darius, said everything. That night, neighbors heard raised voices. Darius yelling. Keisha crying. Patricia's voice, sharp, cutting through the walls. It was a storm waiting to break. And then came the morning of November 17th, Keisha's message to Patricia. 8 words that carried the weight of everything that had happened. We need to talk. I can't do this anymore. Patricia read that message while sitting alone in her kitchen. The sun was rising. Coffee cold in her hands. And as the day went on, she didn't call Darius. She didn't call Keisha. But she waited. She waited for Keisha to walk back through that door. When Keisha did return to the Holloway house later that day, she wasn't seen alive again. Whatever happened inside those walls, whatever was said, whatever final confrontation took place, it ended with Keisha Freeman's life being taken from her. And by the time police arrived, the Holloway family's secrets were laid bare for everyone to see. Some crimes are born in a single moment. But this wasn't one of them. This was a crime that had been growing quietly for months, maybe longer. A crime that grew in silence, in stolen glances, in whispered conversations. And in the end, it exploded in violence. As the investigation began, what detectives found would shock even those who thought they had seen it all. Evidence that told a story more complicated than anyone expected. And when the truth came out, it would leave a town broken, a family destroyed, and a young woman dead, all because of a secret that should never have been kept. By the time the sun reached its peak over Bridgeton, Mississippi on November 17, Patricia Holloway had already made up her mind about something. What exactly that was, we will never fully know. But we know what followed. Keisha Freeman arrived at the Holloway house around 3:15 in the afternoon. She had left a class at the community college earlier that day, seen by a classmate who said Keisha looked anxious, distracted, checking her phone every few minutes. A friend would later say Keisha had been debating whether to meet Patricia at all, unsure what would happen when they finally spoke face to face. But she went. She parked her car in the driveway, the same driveway where she had stood countless times before, but this time, she didn't get out right away. She sat there for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the front door, as if trying to summon the courage to walk in. At approximately 3:35 p.m., according to police estimates, Keisha entered the house. The door closed behind her. And that would be the last time anyone would see her alive. What happened inside that house in the hours that followed would remain a mystery, locked behind walls that couldn't speak. But the aftermath, that would be something no one in Bridgeton would ever forget. Patricia and Keisha were inside the house alone. Darius was not home. He was at a friend's apartment across town, completely unaware of what was unfolding in his family home. At 6:14 p.m., Patricia Holloway made a call, not to the police. Not to Darius. But to her own sister. The conversation, recorded in police records, lasted just under 5 minutes. When questioned later, her sister would say Patricia sounded calm. Almost too calm. As if nothing had happened. But it was during that call that Keisha Freeman was already lying lifeless in Patricia's bedroom. Her body would be found sprawled across the floor, next to the bed, her face turned away from the door. The cause of death would later be determined as blunt force trauma to the head, a single, devastating blow that had crushed her skull, ending her life almost instantly. Detectives would later uncover evidence that told its own story. In Patricia's bedroom, the scene was anything but peaceful. A broken lamp lay on the floor, its base shattered, splintered pieces scattered across the carpet. Blood had soaked into the fibers of the rug beneath Keisha's head. And on Patricia's nightstand, Keisha's phone, screen cracked, smeared with fingerprints, would be found lying next to Patricia's own phone. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence that anyone else had been inside the house. Whatever struggle had taken place, if there even was one, had stayed between the two women. But if Patricia had hoped to hide what happened, it wouldn't last long. At 7:04 p.m., Darius returned home. He later told police that as soon as he stepped through the door, he knew something was wrong. The house was dark, silent. His mother wasn't in the kitchen, where she usually would be at that hour. Keisha's car was still outside, but she wasn't waiting for him on the porch like she sometimes did. When Darius called out for them, for both his mother and Keisha, there was no answer. The silence was thick, suffocating. And then he walked toward the hallway leading to his mother's room. What Darius saw when he opened that door would change his life forever. Keisha, lying still on the floor. Blood staining the side of her head. Her eyes wide open, staring into nothing. And standing in the corner of the room, his mother, Patricia. Her hands covered in blood, her eyes fixed on him. Darius didn't move for a long time. Later, he would tell detectives that in that moment, he couldn't understand what he was seeing. Couldn't process that the woman who had raised him, the woman he trusted more than anyone, was standing over the lifeless body of the woman he loved. Patricia didn't speak. Not at first. She simply looked at him, then looked away. And then she walked past him, leaving her son standing alone in that room with Keisha's body. At 7:22 p.m., Darius made the 911 call. His voice was frantic, broken. The recording, later played in court, captured the moment everything fell apart. "My mom, Keisha's dead, there's blood. I think my mom did something." Police arrived at 7:35 p.m. Two officers entered the home. What they found confirmed Darius's worst fears. Keisha Freeman was dead. Patricia Holloway was arrested on the spot. Her hands still stained with blood. And as she sat in the back of the police cruiser, she didn't say a word. Not to the officers. Not to her son. Not to anyone. The news of Keisha Freeman's death spread through Bridgeton within hours. By nightfall, neighbors had gathered outside the Holloway house. Some stood in shock. Others whispered theories, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. How had Patricia Holloway, a woman known for her kindness, a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others, become the center of such a horrific crime? And what was the truth behind her relationship with Keisha Freeman? As detectives began piecing together the final hours of Keisha's life, they would uncover details that shocked even the most seasoned officers. Text messages. Voicemails. Evidence that pointed to a relationship more complicated, more dangerous, than anyone had guessed. And as the investigation deepened, the story of Patricia Holloway, Darius Holloway, and Keisha Freeman would reveal itself, one layer at a time. A young woman's life was taken. A family was destroyed. And a town was left searching for answers. The investigation into Keisha Freeman's death began before the sun had even set over Bridgeton that night. Within an hour of Patricia Holloway's arrest, the Holloway home on Jefferson Avenue was transformed from a quiet family house into a full-blown crime scene, its windows lit by the flashing red and blue of police cars, its rooms now filled with officers, detectives, and forensic teams trying to piece together the truth. Detective Marcus Reynolds was the first lead investigator on the scene, a man known throughout the county for handling some of the most complex cases in Bridgeton's history. But even for him, what he walked into that night was unlike anything he had seen before. Two women, one dead, one arrested, bound together not just by violence, but by something deeper, something hidden beneath months of secrets. Detectives began they. Patricia admitted to the affair. She told detectives that Keisha had been the one to start it, that Keisha had been confused, that she needed someone to talk to, that it had happened slowly. But what Patricia didn't say was more telling. She never once mentioned remorse. She never once expressed sorrow over Keisha's death. Instead, she talked about betrayal. How she felt abandoned when Keisha started pulling away. How she felt Darius was taking her away. How she couldn't imagine her life without Keisha. Detectives asked her point-blank if she had killed Keisha. Patricia refused to answer. But the look in her eyes, as Detective Reynolds would later describe, was empty. Hollow. Meanwhile, Darius Holloway's world had collapsed. The woman he loved, gone. His mother, behind bars, accused of murder. Friends described him as broken, wandering through town in a daze, avoiding anyone who tried to talk to him. He didn't return to school. He didn't go back to work. In a matter of hours, everything he had known was gone. As the town reeled from the shock, detectives continued building their case. Beyond the text messages, they found more. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, showing Keisha arriving at the Holloway house that afternoon. No sign of anyone else. No sign of her leaving. Autopsy reports confirmed what detectives already suspected. The blow to Keisha's head had been deliberate, precise, and forceful enough to indicate rage, not accident. The way her body was positioned, away from the door, close to the bed, suggested she had been attacked suddenly, perhaps even while trying to leave. In December, just weeks after Keisha's death, Patricia Holloway was formally charged with first-degree murder. The charge sent shockwaves through Bridgeton, a town that had never seen a case like this, never imagined that a family like the Holloways could be hiding something so dark. As the trial date approached, more details began to emerge, details that painted a painful, complicated picture of three lives torn apart by secrecy and obsession. Prosecutors argued that Patricia had killed Keisha out of jealousy and desperation. That when Keisha tried to end the relationship, Patricia snapped. They presented the messages, the forensic evidence, and the strained relationship between Patricia and her son as proof that Patricia had lost control. But Patricia's defense told a different story. They claimed that Keisha had been manipulative, that she had threatened to expose Patricia to Darius, and that Patricia had acted in a moment of panic. They argued it was not murder, but a tragic accident. A claim that would be fiercely contested in court. As Patricia's trial began, the courtroom was filled with members of the community, people who had known the Holloways for years. Some came for answers. Others came because they couldn't believe what they were hearing. And at the center of it all sat Darius, caught between grief for Keisha and the horror of what his mother was accused of doing. For weeks, the court heard testimony. From friends. From detectives. From forensic experts. And then, from Darius himself, a son forced to testify about the night his world fell apart. By the end of the trial, what was clear to everyone was that there were no winners in this story. A young woman was dead. A family was destroyed. And a town was left asking how no one had seen it coming. When the verdict was read, Patricia Holloway's fate was sealed. But for Darius, for Keisha's family, and for everyone who had known them, the pain would not end there. The trial of Patricia Holloway stretched for weeks. Day after day, members of the community gathered in the small courthouse in Bridgeton, waiting to hear what would become of the woman they thought they knew, the woman accused of taking Keisha Freeman's life in cold blood. Some came to support Patricia, still unable to believe that she was capable of murder. Others came for Keisha, for her family, for justice, for answers that no one seemed able to give. At the center of the courtroom, Darius Holloway sat in silence. His face pale, his eyes hollow. The man who had once believed his mother could do no wrong now watched as she stood trial for the murder of the woman he loved. For Darius, the trial was more than a search for justice, it was a reckoning, a slow and painful unraveling of everything he thought he understood about love, loyalty, and family. As the prosecution laid out its case, the evidence was overwhelming. The text messages between Patricia and Keisha. The fingerprints on the broken lamp. The blood found on Patricia's hands and clothes. The autopsy report that confirmed the fatal blow was delivered with deliberate, lethal force. In court, the jury was shown the timeline of Keisha's final hours. Her text message to Patricia, "We need to talk. I can't do this anymore." Her arrival at the Holloway house. And the chilling silence that followed. But it was Darius's testimony that brought the courtroom to its most emotional moment. Sitting on the witness stand, voice shaking, Darius recounted walking into his mother's house that night. Finding Keisha on the floor. Seeing Patricia standing over her. And realizing in that instant that the two women he loved most had destroyed each other, and him. There wasn't a sound in the courtroom as Darius spoke. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the judge sat still, watching a young man tearfully relive the moment his world fell apart. When it was the defense's turn, they fought hard to sway the jury. They called character witnesses to speak about Patricia's life of service, her years of working tirelessly as a nurse, her dedication to her son. They argued that Keisha had manipulated Patricia, played with her emotions, and threatened to reveal their secret affair. They insisted Patricia had acted out of fear, not with the intent to kill, but in a moment of emotional collapse. But for many in the room, there was no defense strong enough to explain Keisha Freeman's death. No excuse that could bring her back. And then, after nearly 2 full days of deliberations, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room was filled to capacity. Family members clutched each other's hands. The judge asked for quiet. And then, the verdict was read. Guilty. Of first-degree murder. The words seemed to hang in the air. Patricia Holloway sat without moving. Her face unreadable. Darius put his head in his hands. Across the room, Keisha's mother wept openly, holding her daughter's picture to her chest. When it was time for sentencing, the judge addressed the court. He spoke about the betrayal of trust, the violence that had taken Keisha's life, the damage done to Darius, and to the entire community. And then he handed down Patricia's sentence. Life in prison. Without the possibility of parole. For Patricia Holloway, the case was over. But for everyone else, the pain was only beginning. In the weeks that followed the trial, Bridgeton was a town in mourning. Keisha Freeman was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery just outside of town. Hundreds of people gathered to say goodbye. Friends, family, even strangers who had followed the story and felt compelled to honor a life taken far too soon. At the graveside, Darius stood alone, tears running down his face, as Keisha's mother clung to the casket. The town that had once seemed so safe, so ordinary, now carried the weight of a tragedy that would never fully fade. For Darius, life would never be the same. The home he grew up in now stood empty, marked with the memories of love, betrayal, and violence. Friends say he moved away from Bridgeton not long after the trial, unable to face the memories that haunted every street, every corner, every shadow. Patricia remains behind bars, serving her sentence at a state correctional facility. Those who have seen her say she speaks to almost no one. That she sits quietly in her cell, staring out the window, as if searching for something she knows she'll never find. And yet, even now, questions remain. Some still wonder if everything that could be known about that day was truly revealed. Was Patricia the only one holding secrets? Did Keisha fear something more than just Patricia? Was there something else, something unspoken, that died with Keisha that day? For a town like Bridgeton, the murder of Keisha Freeman will always be more than just a case. It is a wound, a reminder of how quickly trust can be shattered, how love can turn dangerous, and how secrets, even those buried deep, can destroy everything. This was the story of Keisha Freeman, Patricia Holloway, and Darius Holloway, a story of love, betrayal, and a murder that left a town forever changed. If you or someone you know is caught in a dangerous relationship, don't stay silent. Speak out. Because sometimes, silence can be deadly. What do you think really happened that day inside the Holloway house? Was justice truly served? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that show the hidden darkness in everyday lives, subscribe to In the Shadows of Crime for more.